Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's a bit later than usual, but today the Trudeau government is giving you a peek at the federal books and possibly offering new measures or promises to help you with your day-to-day life. The Fall Economic Statement, also known as FES for us people in the Ottawa bubble, is being released after markets close. What was once just a check-in to see how the numbers look is now often used by governments as a mini budget, a chance to offer Canadians some extra help or to address some pressing fiscal or economic needs in between budgets. The finance minister has already announced elements of this statement, with a 2-month GST holiday worth around $1.6 billion that's currently underway, as well as new housing measures to help people build secondary suites, and changes to pension fund investment rules and tax incentives to spur economic activity. It's something she frames as a way to address the economic nationalism of incoming U.S. President Donald Trump.
Canada is going to fight for Canada. Our government is fighting for Canadian jobs. Our government is fighting for capital.
But what about that promise to keep the deficit at $40 billion? How is the economy actually doing? And could incoming President Donald Trump and his tariff threats be a massive wrench in the gears for figuring out our federal finances? I'm Cormac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, we're previewing the economic statement with Tyler Meredith, a senior fellow with the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, who once served as an economic advisor to the Prime Minister and the current and previous finance ministers. Tyler, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So let's separate this conversation into a few different themes. The state of government finances, measures for Canadians, and let's call it external pressures, although I think we both know what we're talking about with that. But we'll begin with the numbers. What should Canadians be expecting when it comes to the state of our economy and the state of federal books when we get our eyes on this document?
So in some ways, there's two conflicting stories, I think, that are emerging as it relates to both the economy and the state of the books. So in terms of the state of the economy, overall output in the economy is actually doing better than expected. In fact, in the course of the last month or so, Statistics Canada revised upwards its estimates for what we call nominal GDP, which is basically the value of total output in the economy, price times volume. And that's important because it means that there's a larger denominator of goods and services and income floating around in the economy that, as we think about things like debt and deficit, that we can afford those things because we have higher levels of income. But at the same time, overall economic growth in Canada, unlike in the United States, which has actually been doing very well, has been still, I think, largely anemic for a bunch of reasons, in part because we've just been going through a period of low growth. And that's true in much of the rest of the world, except for the United States. And the consequence of that in terms of our fiscal situation is that if you think of the three different guardrails that Minister Freeland has set out as would guide the fiscal policy of the government. Number one being that there would be a deficit last year of about $40 billion. Number two, that the deficit as a share of the economy would continue to track down. And number three, that the debt as a share of the economy would continue to track down. It looks like, although the overall output in the economy is higher, the deficit may come in higher than expected for a bunch of reasons, which we can get into, but that the second and third guardrail may actually be intact. And so it really depends how you look at or what you're looking for in terms of this storyline, because I think there will be a little bit of that everybody can point to as to whether it is met the objectives of the government or not.
The finance minister in several media events was very careful not to talk about the deficit. In fact, every time she was asked about the deficit, she just pivoted towards the debt to GDP ratio, saying we're definitely hitting that. So that could be a very clear signal as to where we're going with the deficit. But how high do you think the deficit could go? The parliamentary budget officer has estimated around $47 billion. There are some people talking about possibly more than that. What's your take?
Yeah. So if you factor in what Minister Freeland said, where she suggested that we will at least meet the existing forecast for the debt to GDP ratio of 42.1%, if that is correct, then given the larger GDP that Canada has experienced because of that uplift in GDP that I just mentioned of about $44 billion, that would translate, if you just stabilize debt at that level, that would translate into a deficit that is potentially $18 to $19 billion higher than originally forecast in the budget. So instead of a $40 billion deficit for last year, it could be as high as 58, 59, 60 billion. Now, in a sense, some people might be alarmed by that, but in context, that's actually not that bad compared certainly to other countries, in the sense that if you look at the United States, last year they had deficits to GDP somewhere in the order of 6 to 7% of GDP, and for Canada that would represent about 1.5%. And so these things are obviously maybe not trending in the direction that Canadians would want, but there's a lot of reasons why the deficit could be higher. Number one, and one thing we don't talk enough about, is that litigation expenses associated with things like Indigenous claims and settlements are often a big driver that can push a government off of their fiscal track unexpectedly so. And these are things that happen below the surface. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether in the fall economic statement, what the composition of that deficit is. Is it happening because of one-time expenses? Is it happening because revenues are coming in less than expected, which would signal a weaker economy? Or is it happening because the government is not able to control expenses very well? Those are three very different scenarios and different stories that we ought to be looking at.
Nonetheless, however you shake it out, it is politics, and we have an election coming up. Do you foresee it being politically damaging if they blow past the $40 billion target figure that they had been talking about, especially since the Conservatives, who are riding high in the polls right now, have been focusing heavily on this?
Yeah, look, so if you ask Canadians, do they care about balancing the budget and how significant of a concern is deficit or debt at this point in time, typically that ranges somewhere in the single digits as a political concern for most people relative to other things like healthcare, the economy, inflation, et cetera. Now, that being said, over time, that level of concern about the debt and the deficit has been rising. And so I think it would not be I think we'd be foolish to ignore that concern. I think where it's probably more of a political factor to consider is that it undermines the government's credibility in terms of if they set guideposts for themselves, can they actually meet it? And do people believe that the government is credible when it sets expectations, right? That's really the issue here, less so the fiscal context. Because if we come in at that number that Minister Freeland kind of signaled in her press conference earlier this week, Canada will still likely have the lowest debt and deficit as a share of GDP in the rest of the G7, right? Certainly way better than the United States and way better than anything that we're looking at in terms of France or Germany. And so in that context, can we afford it? Yes, we can. I think the political dimension is going to largely be, though, about the credibility of the government when it sets tests for itself. Can it meet it?
More on the big story with Tyler Meredith, a former economic advisor to the government, talking about today's fall economic update and how Donald Trump could throw off all the numbers in just a moment. So let's pivot now and start talking about the measures that the government could have for Canadians. We've heard about the GST holiday that Canadians are enjoying. Are you expecting any other interesting nuggets or new measures beyond what's already been announced?
In terms of affordability, probably not, because I think the government wanted to get out as soon as possible to advertise to people that there was help on the way. So on that level, we can probably expect what has already been announced will be the main measures in terms of the $250 that you can expect to receive and the temporary GST holiday. But there's probably going to continue to be other initiatives, maybe less retail for most voters, but important initiatives nonetheless in terms of housing and probably also even on economic growth measures, which are particularly relevant as we go into a potential trade war with the United States. I suspect Minister Freeland is going to come back with some initiatives, perhaps around artificial intelligence, perhaps around investments in industrial capacity, critical minerals. We'll see what comes on that front, but I think she probably wants to also cast a bit of an economic growth narrative, especially at a time in which Canada may be going into a period of headwinds.
The $250 checks that they had promised, but the NDP is not too hot on because they believe it doesn't go far enough. Do you think the government might try to use the fall economic statement as a way to implement that measure?
Well, it's likely that they're going to have to bring forward legislation and a Budget Implementation Act to do that, and so the Fez will be an opportunity to put that forward. And I suspect the government will want to try to seek passage of that. They're going to have to resolve with the NDP whether or not that's expanded, but it would not have made sense to show your hand on that front until the Fez is tabled, because it's going to have a significant fiscal impact. And again, if you get forced into having to expand it, you want to be seen to have been forced to have expanded it because of the entreaties from the NDP, rather than to have gone there automatically. I think what's interesting, just on the question of the deficit and the interaction with the significant measure that was announced on affordability, is that some of that money is probably going to get booked into this past fiscal year, this current fiscal year that we're in, that will end at the end of March, and some of it may go past into next year. And so it'll be interesting to see how that's absorbed, because again, on the question of what the deficit and the debt looks like, it's interesting where that's profiled in the fiscal framework.
Yeah, because if those checks are included but don't kick in till April 1st, they wouldn't apply to this fiscal year. They would apply to next fiscal year. And there could be some playing with the numbers, or at least biding some time for the government to try and play more with the numbers to make that work and look a little bit better for Canadians, correct?
That's right. It sounds like you might know how to craft a budget.
I don't want that responsibility. Let's talk about the border plan. We could be getting $1 billion for our border. Are you expecting to see that in the fall economic statement? There have already been some indications that there will be elements in there.
Yeah, I suspect that we will see at least a fiscal provision that is provided, so that for planning purposes that's there. Whether that's detailed in any way with further indications of what the measures would look like. I think the signal, at least I took from Minister LeBlanc's statements yesterday, was that they wanted to go out and consult more on that, and to be seen to have a fully comprehensive plan that both the provinces and the Americans had reacted to before it's public. So I don't think we'll see the details of it necessarily, but I suspect there will be a language in the document that tells us that they've made a fiscal provision for it.
So a broad sort of scope of things. But could they use that border plan to potentially push through those $250 checks, putting the opposition in a tougher spot to approve border spending while also approving these checks?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's the interesting part of how you craft a budget, especially in minority parliament, right? Is that in addition to the document, the consequence of tabling the document is that there's usually a piece of legislation attached to it called the Budget Implementation Act. And so there's a series of things that the government, having been in the midst of a filibuster, right, for much of the last number of months, has an opportunity here to put forward legislation in an omnibus form that puts together lots of different things that they would want to seek passage of, which could include the money for the checks, as well as potentially the capital gains legislative change to affect the tax change announced in the last budget, which has not been legislated yet, as well as other legislative measures that have kind of stalled, because it's the last opportunity, I think, at least until we get to the budget, where we know that this is probably going to pass, because there will probably be an agreement, at least in terms of accessing those affordability measures, that the NDP will want to make sure that is brought forward.
Now, let's talk about those external pressures I mentioned earlier in our conversation. Obviously, I'm talking about the tariff threat from U.S. President Donald Trump. How does that play into all of this? Because he's going to take office January 20th. That's when he's threatening to bring in these tariffs, and that falls into this fiscal year, which will have to be addressed by the fall economic statement, or possibly. Do you think they're going to be working in some sort of risk factors when it comes to the threat of tariffs from the U.S.?
So I'm not sure that you will see a provision made for that at this point in time, because I don't think the government itself wants to show its hand about its assumptions of what the U.S. administration will do. That would not necessarily signal, would not pretend good news necessarily. I think, though, what you will see instead is, at least if I were there, and what I have seen in the past, is that to deal with that dynamic, which is a real threat, it's a real unknown, right, is typically in the document, there is a description of risks with an upside scenario and a downside scenario, right? And so it would be really sensible in this context to provide more color and detail in that downside scenario about what it would look like if we had a recession potentially brought about by trade disruption, right? So we already know from estimates that have been done from forecasts from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce that if Canada had was exposed to the kind of tariff that Mr. Trump is proposing, although that was estimated on a 10% tariff, not a 25% tariff. And there was full retaliation that we would be looking at a recession potentially in the order of a drop of GDP of about 2.6%. Just for your listeners' context, that's about half of the drop that we saw in 2020 during COVID, right? So a recession about half as bad as COVID, for whatever people may remember of that experience. That would likely, if you just run the math on those numbers, probably lead to an increase in the deficit on top of what's already forecast by about $12 to $13 billion in next year. So that's a significant change, right? And it would have knock-on effects in terms of higher unemployment, access to employment insurance, et cetera. And so I suspect that downside scenario will explain some of those potential risks. They may not call it out as a trade disruption, but you can kind of get the sense that it would be anticipating some order of magnitude recession of that size.
Yeah, and those are just the forecasts. They're not actually built into the figures that we
Framework.
see, the actual framework, as you say. So this tariff threat situation could potentially throw off all of the numbers we see in the economic statement.
Absolutely. And I think that's what Canadians have to kind of get comfortable with, is that we're entering a period of high uncertainty. And in some ways, there's value in the government maybe being a little bit more upfront of saying, yes, we should expect that there will be some disruption. We will get through that. Don't worry, Canada has a plan in terms of how to retaliate. But we should expect that there's a high degree of uncertainty. And the way to deal with that uncertainty is for the government to, I think, start to explain that people should prepare, that there may be a period that we enter into next year, not desirable and hopefully not for a prolonged period, but a period nonetheless that we may enter into where there is potential tariffs applied to our exports and in turn tariffs that we will likely have to apply to imports. And I just think the more that we start to talk about that, businesses start to examine the implications of what that might mean for them, we will be better prepared when that comes, likely in January.
Tyler, anything else you want to add about the fall economic statement that we may have missed?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this fall economic statement is happening, kind of late in December. It's not unprecedented for it to be in December, but we're going to have another fiscal event not long after this, in 3 or 4 months' time, and that budget is actually probably going to be a better representation of what we're actually looking at, because by that point in time we'll have a Trump presidency and we'll know whether or not we're actually in a recession caused by tariffs.
All right, Tyler, Meredith, thank you so much. Really appreciate your thoughts on all of this.
Thanks for your time, Cormac.
That was Tyler Meredith, a senior fellow with the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and a former economic advisor to the government. He was speaking with me about what to expect from the fall economic update and how the incoming president and his tariff threats could pose a challenge to fiscal forecasts. Just a reminder about a new great listening experience for you. You can listen anytime to the Big Story podcast on Seeker. That's SEEKR. I'm Cormac Sweeney. Thanks for listening.